Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to be attempting to write a hopefully a fairly stock pro on the encryption topic. So without further ado, let's begin. First, I have a relatively straightforward method of case writing that I've showcased before, but just one more time. I think there's basically three questions to answer. In like world schools terms, these are burdens. In PF terms, these are uniqueness, link, and impact. The three questions to answer are first, what happens to X thing, in this case, crime, without the resolution or policy? Or plan and LD policy terms. Second question is what changes with X when you pass the policy. So this is the link in PF terms. And then finally, how does this change affect people, usually human beings, um, in a tangible, important way? For affirmative arguments like this one, these questions are essentially what is the problem now, or the problem with not passing the policy. Usually that's just the problem in the status quo. It could be, though, like a forecast of a problem to come. Second question translates roughly to how do we solve that problem with the policy? And the third question is the same. It's the impact, right? So why is that problem so significant? And a good way to answer that is just how does the problem, if unsolved, tangibly affect people? And then, so we have different words for all of this. You could call this uniqueness, link, impact, which are very common terms in PF. You could also call this, on the affirmative, harms, solvency, impact. And sometimes these are like policy terms. Sometimes people put the impact before the solvency, which might be relatively straightforward since the impact comes from the harms that are happening in the status quo trajectory. But you could do it either way. It doesn't really matter. I will be using the first model, the one that I'm used to from PF, which is uniqueness, link, impact. It's just three different questions. So let's ask the first question. What happens to crime without the resolution, aka in the status quo? So what I want to say is crime is increasing slash will increase if we don't pass this policy. And part of that is just like an explanation of why alternative solutions aren't going to be enough. Like we're not on track to solve it in some other alternative way, which is the response that the opponents would use to quote unquote non-unique this argument and say that it will be solved in either world. And so it's not really a pressing need to pass this policy. So I guess we can start there. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to think of cards that I have in my little encryption spam. And I'll just like put the one that I think is most relevant here. So first, maybe I can put this card about FBI, which says that criminals plan and carry out their attacks through electronic communications. And it is rapidly eroding, blah, 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 blah. So I'll just like copy this. I'm sure there's good uniqueness stuff in here. And then I'll just take out all the stuff that is irrelevant to my uniqueness. So let's see. Criminals can plan and carry out crimes. So I'm just going to make this a little bit more efficient here. Through electronic communications. Um, Access to digital evidence is critical for law enforcement to stop threats and protect victims. I think it's sufficient. Then I don't really need this, but I could say lawful access is rapidly eroding, approaching a tipping point. Maybe I don't need both. Maybe I'll just say fast approaching a tipping point, or even just rapidly approaching a tipping point might just sound better. So is rapidly approaching a tipping point. So this is good because it's not necessarily like what is happening right now, but it's what will happen if we don't do anything, because providers are deploying warrant-proof encryption, which prevents anyone other than end users, or I'll just say device owners, from seeing content. Providers are unable to deliver information to law enforcement when compelled, created lawless digital spaces, doing all of these bad things. And then the bad things I'll just put in the impact section. Well, I can include them here. And then victims may be deprived of justice. I don't really need that because my argument is not focusing necessarily on justice for victims. Law enforcement will have to rely on alternative investigative methods. Okay, this is another point that I can put in my uniqueness that like, okay, so we have point one, right? Like crime is increasing. Point two, other things are not going to solve that without the AF. And then point three, like alternative solutions might be actively harmful. So if the affirmative avoids those, um, that's like an extra benefit. And we can throw that in here with this, right? Law enforcement will have to rely on alternative methods, which can be dangerous, um, come at a great expense, and are often not scalable or timely substitutes. Great. And then obviously the implication is that they wouldn't have to rely on that if we do the policy, which will be the link later. So this seems like fine uniqueness. Let's grab the citation real quick through my like little extension. If you don't have the site creator extension on Google Chrome, I would definitely advise you to get it. I don't think this has a date, so we could just put no date. No date. So let's see. I don't think this is actually an author, so I'll put FBI. And then well, I should have done this on my other document where I have it all formatted nicely, but this is fine. FBI, no date, blah, blah, blah. So the tag I can put here is absent lawful access. Criminals increasingly have a safe haven for plotting, which decks law enforcement's ability to prevent um, destructive crimes. Alternative investigative methods are dangerous, costly, and fail to prevent these crimes too adequately, I'll say. Cool. Or maybe I'll just say fail to prevent most crimes. Fail to effectively prevent crimes. Prevent crimes. Cool. So that's our uniqueness card. That looks good for now. The next thing we'll talk about is the link. Before we get to the link, I actually just want to highlight one that this card on its own actually fulfills all three of these things that we're looking for our uniqueness to do. It says that crime maybe doesn't have data that crime is increasing, but it gives warrants why it will likely increase if we don't pass this policy. It says that alternative solutions aren't going to be enough, that they're not effective substitutes, and that they might actually be harmful, they might be dangerous. It doesn't really give a warrant for that. I wish that it explained that a little bit more, but it's good enough for now for our purposes for a first pass at a stock AF. Second thing I want to say about this card, I got a comment on my last YouTube video. What do you think about the validity of citing the FBI on the AF? Is it a reverse qual, as in like qual meaning qualification, like author qualification, or do they have authority to speak on this? Is it a reverse qual, meaning is it something that actually takes away the credibility of the source? I think it might be. There's a few reasons to think of that this might be a reverse qual. The first one is this evidence from Hoban, which talks about the FBI having a long history of being very violent with its surveillance against the civil rights movement, for example, against Black leaders, all throughout history, including sort of modern history as well. It could be argued that the FBI now is a different organization. I don't really know how different it would be, but this could definitely be an argument that is made against this being used as a source. A second source here says that the FBI has, for example, lied about things in the past. And has misled judges in like legal processes. So if it's lied about other things, why wouldn't it lie about this? And then third and finally, I think that there is just a logical argument to be made here that like clearly the FBI as a law enforcement agency has some stake in this debate. They have some bias. They clearly would prefer that affirmative policy to be passed because it would make their lives easier as an organization. And so maybe they're not completely writing this article from a neutral sort of third party point of view. However, there might be some responses to this. Like, I don't think it's necessarily that bad to use the FBI. Government agencies might have less incentives to lie and might actually be more credible than other comparable authors who might be saying similar things. I think that a lot of these logical arguments apply to many different sources. And you could also argue that maybe some of the content in this card doesn't depend on the source that it comes from. It can be sort of separated from the author, and is just sort of factual and needs to be contested on its factual basis instead of on like the bias or stance of the author. I think this is like an okay argument. It's a little bit sketchy. I think the easiest thing to do is probably just find a different card that says similar things, which should be relatively straightforward. I'm not going to do it right now, just in the interest of time, but I'll probably replace this card later with a similar one that says very similar things. The last thing that I want to say, by the way, is I know that I'm doing this sort of step by step. So answer the uniqueness question, then answer the link question. And I'm doing it with different cards. I want to make it clear that like you don't necessarily need to do this. Like I could use this FBI card for both the uniqueness and the link, since it does explain how requiring like backdoors being built in actually might solve this problem. And so then I would, feed two birds with one scone kind of thing, and it would might make the rest of my case more efficient. But just for the sake of this case right now, I am probably going to add different cards for the link, especially to nuance it a little bit more, because I don't necessarily think the FBI card is doing everything that I want it to do with the link. So the next question that I want to ask with the uniqueness actually is what responses might the other team make? They might make the response that alternative solutions work. We've kind of already taken that out in two ways. And they might make the response that crime is decreasing. I think we've also sort of addressed that. We might want extra evidence on either of these questions that says, like, here's statistical evidence that crime is increasing in encrypted spaces or something like that. But I don't necessarily think that it's super necessary. So I think we're okay just having what we have now. So I guess next we can actually move on to the link. Next step in this process is the link. So the question related to this contention for the link is how does crime actually change, or how do we solve the kinds of crime that we're talking about in the uniqueness with the resolution? So once the resolution is passed, why does that crime decrease? I guess this seems somewhat inherent to the uniqueness, and this is a good sign. We want our uniqueness to be as tied to the resolution as possible. So the warrant for the uniqueness, like the reason why something bad is happening, is just because we haven't done the resolution, and I think we've done a pretty good job of doing that because our FBI card here is like deeply related almost exclusively to the fact that law enforcement can't get easy access to encrypted data. And so what I've done here is I've gone ahead and slightly changed the tag. So I put only requiring lawful access solves. And I highlighted this stuff at the very bottom that's like law enforcement agencies want providers to be able to decrypt data and provide it to law enforcement only in response to US legal process. I feel like that kind of implies that this is the solution that they're advocating for to the problem that is also in the card. And I think it makes sort of logical sense because the whole warrant in the card for why there's a problem is because there isn't lawful access, right? It talks about how lawful access is eroding. So clearly requiring the provision of lawful access would logically seem to entail solvency for that problem. So, okay, we have a link. That seems fine. The problem is, I think this is maybe the hardest part of our argument to defend. I've been racking my brain for like an hour at this point for how we can find evidence to really defend the link, just because I think that there's a lot of potential responses that the con side can offer that will severely mitigate the extent to which we can solve this crime. There's two especially that come to mind. One is just like even if this all goes according to plan, it still just might be hard to catch the criminals. Like there's just a lot of data. Maybe there's not enough resources. Maybe it's hard to get the warrants, etc. I think in order to account for this, like first of all, I think this is the weaker of the two responses. I'm not too worried about this, but we can add a deterrence link sort of perceptually to partially address this, and maybe that will give us a little bit more ground on the link, magnify our link a little bit, so that even if they do have a lot of mitigatory defense, this will ensure that it doesn't matter as much as it otherwise might. But the second one is the one I'm more worried about, which is like circumvention arguments. So one example of a circumvention argument is maybe the con will say criminals will just make their own encryptions apart from technology companies. So just requiring technology companies to create a backdoor for law enforcement isn't enough because these end-to-end encryption things, maybe they exist as code on the internet or something. So criminals could just make their own and then their communications are impossible to detect. So I think the only way that we can deal with that is if we find evidence that, or explain logically why it is harder for criminals to do this or why it's easier to catch them if they do. I think this is possible. I think it's easier to explain this logically than find evidence for this, but I've attempted to do both. Um, So I honestly spent like an hour, upwards of an hour looking for evidence for any data on any of this. It's like seems very difficult to find data that like lawful access to encrypted communications would have any deterrent effect or statistically how significant that effect would be, especially because this just hasn't really happened in the world yet. And so logically, it's hard to find like empirical data that would support that. So instead, I just found empirical data of a similar warrant that seems like it could be applicable here. This is less powerful because the con team could still take issue with our application of this data to this resolution, but I think it's relatively straightforward. So I found a lot of evidence that says like surveillance cameras deter crime, and statistically that this is significant, and that they don't like just push crime elsewhere, which I guess is also the argument the con would be making for circumvention, that they would just like push their communications elsewhere, for instance. And so the argument that I would be making here is that this evidence from Uruguay supports the idea that like surveillance in general does deter criminals who act on rational choice, and the same incentive structure for these actors should apply either way, right? Like these actors have they perceive themselves to have some incentive and some capability of doing crime, right? Their incentive maybe is based on desperation or a perceived financial benefit to themselves of committing crime. And the capacity is the question in their minds of how likely they think they are to be able to go through with that and actually access those rewards they perceive to be there of crime without getting stopped in the process or without a higher negative disincentive to be cast upon them. So in their heads, these criminals do a calculation that's like percent chance I get the good thing from the crime, and then balance it against the percent chance that I get the bad thing from the crime. And maybe they're not always rational, but like this evidence seems to support the idea that in general this does hold up. And so the presence of a law that guarantees that police can watch you even on encrypted communications should have a similar deterrent effect as the presence of surveillance cameras that guarantee that the police can watch you in different areas of the city. Maybe it's not quite one to one, but certainly the same logic should probably apply. It's probably the burden of the con to explain why it doesn't apply. And even if they explain why it doesn't apply quite as much, it's going to be difficult for them to explain why it doesn't apply at all in this case. So at best, they will be able to mitigate the statistical significance of this. And maybe we can find reasons why it like will actually apply even more in these phases. I don't know what those would be, but that would be helpful to have. So I'm going to retag this and recut this real quick. So this evidence says surveillance. So I'll tag this as like surveillance empirically deters crime um, without pushing it elsewhere. Surveillance in particular spaces. So, for example, particular communications channels empirically deters crime without pushing it elsewhere. Um, for example, surveillance cameras in Uruguay deterred 20% of crime, um, and by increasing the fear that criminals would be apprehended, the same logic will apply to online um, to surveillance of encrypted spaces. Boom. Okay, I think that's fine. Like we can admit it's not quite the same, but like I'll even put similar logic. Similar logic applies to surveillance of encrypted spaces. Um, and maybe we can even put like even though the data does not yet exist because such laws have yet to be implemented. There we go. So we're justifying why we're using this evidence instead of other data. Fine. Okay, so how can we recut this card to make it more efficient? Cities use surveillance cameras. Sure. I'm just going to unhighlight that. Findings indicate a 20% reduction in crime in areas where cameras are located with no evidence of a displacement effect. Um, then um, we can just, so the bottom of this concludes that it's deterrence. So police presence makes criminal activity less attractive. Um, and then our estimates should be interpreted as a deterrent effect. Cool. Great. Next piece of evidence is to address the other concern. So we've just addressed the deterrence argument. I want to address it is like easier to catch criminals when they try to circumvent and like go make their own hardened communications networks. So I found evidence that like kind of sort of maybe says that in the context of encryption. So this evidence is in the context of the UK. Um, in fact, is it in the context? No, I think it's yeah, I think it might be in the context of the UK or like the EU more generally. I guess the UK is not in the EU, but let's see. This is about transnational crime. This guy was from the French National Police. So this is actually the EU, I think. So what is he saying? So the top of this says national agencies have significantly increased capacities to target hardened communications and access their contents. I'm going to take out remotely. We don't really need that. That seems implied. Um, and actually, I don't even think we need access. That's probably implied as well. Successful operations such as the ones against EncroChat or Sky ECC, which incidentally, these are like criminals have made these hardened communications networks that are encrypted themselves specifically for the goal of criminal activity absent tech companies, it seems. So this is exactly what the con would be arguing is the likely alternative the criminals will turn to. So the fact that we can find successful operations against these things is already a good sign. So what's next? Result in the collection of massive amounts of communications? Sure. National local investigation services have increased their ability to detect information. I don't think we need this. This is implied above. It has often proven successful. We don't really need this. We don't really need any of that. Um, Sure, I don't think we need this. Irrelevant. What is important is this. The main current legislative loopholes relate to mainstream instant messaging. Post-arrest seizure is not enough. Real-time access is crucial for investigation. I don't think we need for investigation. Interceptions and arrests, we don't need that. Um, can help police prevent threats to life. For example, sure, enabled the police to prevent numerous homicides or acts of torture. This is actually good too, because this seems like empirical evidence that something like this works, right? Like if the con is right about their defense, then when these like criminals get caught on these communications networks, it should be true that they just switch, right? But given that they were caught and the communications, like these things were prevented, I guess this is empirical evidence that it kind of works. Maybe it's a little bit different, but I think this is good to keep in here for now. Investigations reveal that mainstream encrypted apps are widely used by criminals. And then here's the important thing. Mainstream end-to-end encrypted communication services are abused. So maybe we don't really need that part. These communications applications, as opposed to the criminal ones, provide legitimate encryption and are therefore used by a much larger base of users. This allows criminals to blend in securely. So I can say these communications applications, as opposed to the criminal ones, are used. The warrant seems like self-explanatory. By a much larger base of users. This allows criminals to blend in securely in the absence of proper measures to decrypt their communication. So this is great, right? This sort of implies a warrant for why it is harder for law enforcement to catch criminals using mainstream like tech company, right? Like tech company end-to-end encrypted communications. In the absence of an ability to decrypt them, it is harder for law enforcement to address those compared to addressing, it is easier then to address the ones that are criminal in nature themselves and not related to a tech company that could provide data. So this seems like a good preempt to them saying this circumvention argument. So I'm fairly happy with this right now, although I will admit it's been difficult to find all of the evidence for this. I've just stumbled across like boatloads and boatloads of more con evidence in the process, but we'll get to that in the next video. So good. We have our link. We've sort of secured our link in a few different ways. We have the sort of direct link in the FBI card. We have an additional mechanism for that link from deterrence that can magnify that link and maybe get around some potential con defense. Then we have an additional preempt against any potential argument on the con that says that it will just be circumvented. Cool. So, and maybe I can retag that, but I don't need to do that right now. So then the final part of this is the impact. How does this change affect people in a tangible, important way? So that's where we get to just play with all of these cool different crime impact scenarios and really make the most out of these impacts. Is now much later. I took a break and I also did a lot of research and work on the impact level. This also means I probably won't be able to have time for GeoGuessr today, but that is okay. So the impact question is, of course, how does this actually affect people in a material way? We are talking about crime, so how does crime hurt people? Relatively straightforward, but we can do a lot here to make this very strategic. So the obvious answer to this is like we stop a lot of big crimes that hurt people. It would be useful for us to talk about crime in a way that makes it seem like it's a much bigger impact than anything that the con has, so that we can outweigh or control that impact calculus so that they would have to be forced to link into ours, and then we could just play, whack-a-mole against any of their link-ins. And so that's the first thing that I thought about doing. So I thought, why not throw in like a human trafficking argument? That's an impact that I think will be relatively difficult for them to simply outweigh on magnitude. The like extinction versus human trafficking debate is not as simple as extinction versus other impacts. And I'm sure it's like relatively straightforward to put some framing on it or something like that. So it's more likely that you're forcing the con to link in, which is a good state of play for you to be in because you can just control that link versus link debate with things like uniqueness and some logic on why your link is probably going to be better than their link in. The other questions to ask here on the impact level, because again, remember, like this is how we're writing the case. On the uniqueness level, we consider all of the ways they could respond. On the link level, we consider all of the ways they could respond. We account for them, we circumvent them. Then on the impact level, we do the same thing, but we're not just considering impact defense here. I don't think there are that many responses that are like crime doesn't matter, or whatever. Like they probably aren't going to say that. So instead, we should be considering the more strategic questions, which is how will they plan to outweigh, and how can we control the weighing in this round with the impacts? What the impacts are there for, after all. It's useless to put in impacts if we're not doing it intentionally in order to outweigh what we expect the other side to run. So how might the stock con try to outweigh? I think there are largely two from the stock, right? Like they're either going to say cyber vulnerabilities are the most important impact, or they're going to say government overreach is the most important impact. They will also probably try more with cyber vulnerabilities probably to like link this somehow into crime later in the round. I bet that will be a very common approach. So if we can figure out how to filter our impacts a little bit so that it is harder for them to link in with just like encryption solves or like weakening encryption links. That's the first thing we want to do. But the second thing we want to do is figure out how we can then link our impacts into some of the impacts that they're talking about, like cyber and government overreach. So for cyber, I think the comparison we should say is we also stop hackers, right? Like cyber criminals are criminals. We also find their communications and such. The uniqueness that's useful here is like there are lots of different ways for hackers to do cyber attacks, even with encryption, right? Like malware, for instance, ransomware. If you send someone an email with like a link to a virus, this is not stopped by encrypted communications. And then that means that like there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are non-unique. So vulnerabilities, which is the con link, are largely non-unique compared to the uniqueness of this ability to stop criminals. And then the second point for the weighing on the link into cyber is that cybercrime is empirically increasing. So we can do like this, like clearly encryption is not working, and control the uniqueness on that as well. And then it also could be useful to just be like, yes, obviously there could be breaches through backdoors, but it is less likely that this happens through like cyber criminals having unlimited communications to exploit all of the other vulnerabilities that aren't that backdoor. Um, Plus, I thought about this filter, which is like maybe the worst forms of cyber attacks, like the ones that really damage things like infrastructure, are the ones that cannot be prevented with encryption and only can be prevented with like learning more about the communications of the cyber hackers or whatever. And so that's what I attempted to do with cyber. Then I considered the government overreach argument the con will likely run. I think there's two ways we can try to link into this. First, with this sort of scalar link about watchdogs, like we improve government accountability by increasing the amount of um, like evidence that can be used. And actually, now that I think about it, I'm not even sure this is like a link to crime. Um, it might just be like a totally separate argument. But I put it in there. Maybe I'll take it out and make it its own argument, but it's in there right now. So there's an argument that we improve government accountability, which might outweigh their link because it's like probably the ability for the government to do intrusive surveillance is non-unique, not really meaningfully affected in a unique way by the resolution compared to the unique effect on subpoena information and evidence for watchdogs. And B, government overreach can happen in lots of different ways that we check back, whereas their link on the con is only about one form of government overreach through surveillance. There are lots of forms of government overreach that don't depend on surveillance that we would check back against on our side. And then abuses of government power. Um, oh yeah, this is the second link, which I think I accidentally took out, which is the terrorism link in. If we can prevent any terrorist attacks, those terrorist attacks in the counterfactual world of the con would have otherwise spurred the government or allowed the government to have an excuse to have more sudden, worse forms of dangerous surveillance that are also less likely to be effective in the way that the AF uniquely is. So we can sort of link turn all of the neg arguments, or at least this overreach argument, if we win a terrorism link, which is great. And then we could probably do extra weighing on that link. Like maybe it's also always on scope because it like goes global with renewed war on terror. It affects like the authoritarianism applies to other countries and stuff. Which allows us to have a lot of good weighing. So then I divided this up into essentially four different impacts. Again, it's iffy if the third one is actually an impact of this contention. Maybe it's just a separate contention, but it's in there. So we have human trafficking, cybercrime, accountability, and terrorism. And here is my first attempt at a full draft. So we have uniqueness here, plus like the link at the bottom. Then we have the deterrence mechanism. Then we have this. I changed up the tag on this a little bit to really emphasize the scalarity of it. This argument about how even if they move to more expensive hardened networks and try to circumvent this, those are comparatively easier to trace and catch. So great, we have that evidence. So we have lots of good preemption to the defense we're expecting on the link from the con. Then four impacts. First is modern slavery. So again, it will be hard for them to just straightforwardly outweigh this on magnitude, which makes this a useful impact. It is most useful, though, if it can, one, outweigh on magnitude, and importantly, two, control the link into itself and prevent it from being easily linked into from their side, right? So we want this to be insulated from the stock arguments they have as much as possible, such that they can't simply be like, oh, well, we affect that as well. So there's two ways that I tried to make sure that we're doing this strategically. The first one is the uniqueness here. It's risen 700%. Like clearly encryption is not working, which means if we can phrase this as a comparison between two possible solutions, right? One solution on their side is encryption. One solution on our side is this lawful access to communications. Then clearly like theirs is very much not working. So it's like try or die for ours. I don't really like that term, but it is at least more likely that ours will work given that theirs is failing so dramatically. And then here's the other card that sort of puts the other side of this comparison, which is like ours probably definitely will work. And there's something really nice about this card. So this card is all about how human traffickers use cryptography. They use end-to-end encrypted communications. The most important part of this card that I only realized at the very end of cutting it is this part here, that smugglers use social media for recruitment and a bunch of other stuff. The recruitment part is important though, because a lot of the circumvention arguments the con might use as defense to the link are about how criminal organizations and criminals in general will turn to other forms of communication. But if they're the only ones who are doing that, like those other forms of communication will necessarily have less exposure to victims, right? It will be much harder for them to communicate with victims in like this like these other encrypted or hardened communications that are not run by tech companies, right? Which means I think there's a very good argument here that we can say it is likely that there isn't very much circumvention because any circumvention they do will necessarily massively reduce the scope of victims that they have access to, thereby also reducing the potential for profits and the ease of their work in doing human trafficking, which will necessarily decrease the amount of human trafficking and the harms of human trafficking, even if circumvention happens with 100% probability. So that's a great argument that is just like a spike that is unique to this impact that also makes it difficult for them to try to use that link defense as mitigation to outweigh and try to explain why one of their links in is better. This like makes it much clearer that this is like an exclusive link to the AF that they can't simply steal. Great. Um, Second is cyber attacks. So Here again, this is a really important card. I'm trying to be very carefully strategic here in saying like both sides link into cyber attacks, but only we link into the biggest magnitude cyber attacks, right? So it's likely that if they have a cyber attack impact on their case, it's going to be like big things go big boom, right? But that would depend on something like hacking critical infrastructure, which doesn't happen through hacking encrypted communications. It happens through malware and stuff like that, which is totally different. And these vulnerabilities are already all over the place, so clearly non-unique. So the only way we could stop them is preventing them from having communications and planning these kinds of elaborate schemes to introduce malware to this critical infrastructure. And this says it could like spark war, could bring a state to its knees. This is like big in magnitude stuff. This card says that like companies are bad at cybersecurity because they don't want to invest the resources into it. So even if they have cards that's like quantum encryption is incredible, we could just say, okay, most large companies don't spend money on that, or they don't implement it correctly, or they delay too much, or whatever. There's still vulnerabilities despite this. This card says there's 5 million cyber attacks, that cyber attacks have risen substantially. They doubled since 2018. So again, clearly encryption is not working. And then this evidence is specific to ransomware, which is now becoming one of the biggest kinds of cyber attacks, most devastating to national security. It says that that has risen 34% in 2025. Again, something that their link cannot link into. So that creates a great side constraint on which side has better cyber links. Then third, we have government accountability. So this is about how watchdogs are less effective at monitoring because they can't get evidence from end-to-end encryption. And then I have like three reasons that this outweighs their possible link on government overreach. This one is just a generic card that like watchdogs is really important. And they also create things like community accountability and corporate accountability, not just government accountability, which is an additional net benefit to this link. And then finally, terrorism. I just put a generic card here that's like, when there is a terrorist attack, the political reaction makes way more surveillance more suddenly, and it's like less likely to be effective necessarily, which should be a straight link turn on most of the government overreach stuff that they have on their case, if we can win any scalar link into terrorism. So this case is very, I think, strategically set up to beat most of the con complaints about the case and most of the stock con arguments. So next time I will actually write the con and see if we can deal with any of this. But I'm pretty happy with how the pro turned out, especially because I was just like a few hours ago, I was kind of pulling my hair out over how I think the pro doesn't have a lot of great evidence, and most of the evidence I was finding is con evidence. If you look in my like card spam now, it is like dominated by con evidence. I found some great evidence for the con that I'm excited to write into a case next time. But for now, I will leave you with this draft of a pro case. Pretty happy with how it turned out, and I'm excited to hear all of your thoughts. Again, I'll start the next one with a Q&A, depending on how many questions there are. So thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you later.